Okay, so welcome to Jack Bobo, who is now the Director of Global Food and Water Policy. Is that correct?
That's my last job with the
That's
Nature
your last
Conservancy.
job. Okay, so I'm going to let you introduce yourself. I know that you've recently finished the book "Why Smart People Make Bad Choices," and this is looking at food choices. So I want to talk to you about that. But first of all, could you just introduce yourself, Jack, and tell us how you've ended up in Nottingham and what you were doing before that?
Yeah. Well, my name is Jack Bobo. I'm the director of the Food Systems Institute here at the University of Nottingham, and I've been here for about 8 months now. Delighted to have moved to the UK to launch this new research institute. A little bit about my background: I spent 13 years with the U.S. Department of State working on global food policy. A few years covering Africa, then Asia, then Europe policy. My last few years, my only job was giving speeches. So I had an unlimited travel budget, could travel anywhere in the world and just talk about the future of food, the role of science, and how to better communicate and engage with the public. So just a great opportunity. Spent a few years as a food futurist, and a futurist is a term you give yourself so that you can get more money as a consultant. And then after that, I was with the Nature Conservancy, which is the world's largest conservation organization, as director of global food and water policy. But I moved here to launch this new institute because I think, this is an opportunity to shape the future of food, and universities are sort of uniquely positioned to do that because they touch so many parts of the food system.
Mm. So when you were working as an advisor to the US government, were there specific projects that you can remember advising on while you were there?
Yeah, so I worked there under a couple administrations, worked for four secretaries of state at the State Department. And, I worked on a variety of things: food security issues, GMO policy, which is always controversial, and, engaging with Europe. Worked on the global standards, global treaties, and things like that related to food trade. Uh, you know, there were different challenges in different places, whether it's dealing with Asia, dealing with Europe on GMO policy, dealing with food security crises in sub-Saharan Africa. It really covered a lot of different aspects of food policy because, food is so critical to people, but it really touches us in our lives. And so I think people are particularly sensitive when dealing with food issues.
Yeah. So which administrations did you work under, if you don't mind me asking?
So I worked under the George Bush administration and the Obama administration. I worked with Secretary Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Hillary Clinton, and then John Kerry before I left.
Okay. So that was before it all started going wrong.
Before the changes. So yeah, I left in 2015.
Right. Okay. And you've written a book called Why Smart People Make Bad Choices. I'm interested in I mean it's a very evocative title, I suppose, isn't it? What are the bad choices that you think people are making, that you think smart people are making?
Yeah, so the book "Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices." I wrote the book though because when you think about food, in many ways, that we have this obesity epidemic in the United States, but really globally as well. So just as background, 42% of all Americans are obese, 75% are overweight or obese. Here in the UK, about 25% of the public is obese, and about 65% are overweight or obese. So the US is ahead, but really the rest of the world is moving right along with us. And the change has come remarkably quickly. Before 1970, basically no country in the world had an obesity rate above 15%. And to, or yeah, above 15, or sorry, uh, before 1970, no country had an obesity rate above 15%. And today, basically no country has an obesity rate below 15%. So,
Yes.
and the countries that have it below, it's because they have severe crises like South Sudan and other things. And so things have changed remarkably quickly. Obesity rates in the United States were lower than most of Europe before 1970. And, I think most people would be shocked to realize that. And so, my question was, why did this happen so quickly? I mean, in many ways, we've never known more about health and nutrition than we do today, and yet we've never been more obese. We've never had better menu labeling, food package labeling. We've never had more choices in the grocery store. So, like, all the things that should be delivering healthy outcomes are failing. And
Mm.
so that was sort of the question I was asking. And so in the book, I go back and I look at consumer psychology. How is that leading us astray? How has our food system changed in the last 50 or 60 years that has really driven these outcomes? Because, a lot of people focus on, willpower, and a lot of books are about, how you can change what you eat. But, willpower hasn't changed in the last 50 years, and our genetics haven't changed in the last 50 years. But what has changed is how we engage with food. And I think very, very often, we sort of don't think about that in terms of trying to fix the problem. We're trying to fix us when maybe we're not the problem. It's the environment in which we find ourselves.
Mm. And I suppose that environment is involves aggressive sales techniques.
Well, it does, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And so, a lot of this goes back to, we think about things like supersizing. Well, the history of supersizing is that there was a guy named David Wallerstein back in the 1960s, and his job was to convince us to eat more popcorn in the cinemas. And he tried lots of different things, but the one thing that worked was when he offered the jumbo size popcorn. And as soon as he did, sales of soda took off and everything at the concession stand took off. And it's because we see it as good value. You pay a little bit more money and you get a lot of something, that just seems like a good deal. And so, unfortunately, though, it works with our psychology. And Wallerstein, after he left the cinema chain, he went to work for a guy named Ray Kroc, who owned a small restaurant chain called McDonald's. You may have heard of it. And he convinced the owner, Ray Kroc, to offer the large size fry back in 1972. And as they say, the rest is history. And so, things changed, but consumers were like right along with it. I mean, they thought this was an amazing change. And, in terms of how governments have responded, back in 1979, the US was developing the dietary guidelines. And so they were trying to decide, should we focus on, you always have to have an enemy. And so, was it going to be fat or was it going to be sugar? And they decided to make fat the enemy in that, and, urge people to eat less fat. Well, food companies actually did what you kind of hoped they would do. They offered low fat versions of all of their food. So that would be salad dressing and yogurt and all sorts of things. The problem is low fat does not equal low sugar, and
Yeah.
the calories are actually generally higher. But that psychology kicked in, and we thought, well, if one low fat cookie is good for me, the entire bag's going to be great, and we ended up even consuming more. And so the things that we do in order to, improve the situation have often, made it more complicated and sometimes worse.
Mm. I mean, it's clearly a very complicated kind of set of reasons that has caused people to eat more, kind of psychological reasons as well as kind of kind of options that are available to them that weren't available to them before. I mean, could it be
Our,
that we are
our
less happy now and so we eat more?
Well, I think, yeah, behavior and our mood is certainly part of it. The problem is that, the more stressed you are, the more you eat, the more depressed you might be about how much you eat. And so we've kind of lost some of that joy in food. We
Yeah.
stress about food all the time. So even if you're not, overweight, you may be sort of very conscious of the food you eat. And that for me is a huge part of the problem, and something that I talk about in the book is that
Mm.
what we really want is a food environment that simply delivers healthy outcomes. And that seems a little bit crazy, but that's the world back in 1960. Our parents or grandparents, they were not counting calories, they knew nothing about nutrition, they were cooking with lard, and yet somehow nobody ended up, obese. And that's because the environment was actually delivering, that outcome. And yet, we're trying to fix it at the individual level, and we've got all of these pressures. I mean, if somebody serves you two adult servings of food on your plate, it's not shocking that you eat 10 or 20% more than what
Mm.
you need, if not twice as much. And, most consumers today don't even know what an adult serving of food looks like. And I'll give you an example. I mean, imagine if you went to a McDonald's, you got the small fry. Well, that's a large fry from 1972. And you got the kids meal hamburger, and you got a 6-ounce soda. That would be an adult serving of food in 1955.
Yes.
And most of us, it's like, it's not even a child's portion today, or at least we wouldn't think of it as that. And so much has changed that if a restaurant gave you that amount of food, you would never go back.
Mm.
Right. So, uh,
Yeah.
so there's these huge challenges, and, restaurants, the cost of the food they put on your plate is not the most expensive part of running a restaurant. The biggest cost drivers are labor and real estate.
Mm.
And so why wouldn't they give you more food if you won't come back if they don't?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it is human nature to kind of eat as much as you can when it's available, isn't it? So I suppose,
It
it's
is.
historically that's what happened, isn't it?
Yeah. And so part of what I talk about in the book are there things that we could do differently? In Europe, it's not nearly as common to take leftovers home as it is in the United States. And so, one, if you don't feel that obligation to clean your plate, well, then at least there's hope that you could take part of it with you. But there are also things where restaurants could sort of give you the option of your to-go bag before you take your first bite. Like they give you half portion, they give you half to go. And my thinking is, if you eat two meals for the price of one, that's terrible value. But if you
Mm.
get two meals for the price of one and you get the second one for that evening or the next day, that's incredible value. And so it's
Yeah.
not really about punishing the restaurant for giving me extra food. It's about figuring out how to work with the restaurant to sort of maximize my health and maximize my value.
Yeah. And I suppose it's also about education, isn't it? Which I suppose is kind of brings us back to the other part of the title where you said smart people make bad choices. So is this about education?
For me, it's much less about education, and that's because we need to reshape the environment. Like you need to get the right choices in front of you, or it just doesn't help. And an example is, let's say that the restaurant you're going to serves large portion sizes, and you divide the food and you only eat half of it. Well, the problem with the psychology is our brain thinks we didn't finish our dinner. And so 2 hours later, you will be hungry even though you had enough calories, because psychologically, you think you didn't finish your meal. And
Mm.
so it's actually information alone isn't sufficient because our body behaves as if we got what we think we got. And so it's hard. That's why it's so much harder to actually figure this out on our own. We need to only be served the food we're going to eat. Otherwise we're still going to overeat later in the evening.
They should probably restrict or ban altogether the idea of eat all you can for a certain price. I had this experience last Sunday when I went out for a meal with some friends to the Chinese restaurants, and I'm not really used to this idea, but you pay quite a big amount of money and then you can eat all you can eat. But I left there feeling quite ill from the amount that I'd actually consumed. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think that that's actually just troubling because you are incentivized to overconsume. And, there's no amount that you can eat that's going to keep you from eating a next meal. I mean,
Yeah.
you're just going to still want a meal later on. And so it's, it's that there's poor value in terms of your health and in terms of your wallet.
Mm. And of course, the food itself is kind of um, put together in such a way that you want to keep eating it. I mean, I remember an experiment that I saw years ago where they mixed fats and sugars together and fed it to rats, and they found that perfect combination between fats and sugar that a rat just could not stop eating. It would eat and eat until it was ill, at least. So I suppose, food processing and food manufacturers and the sort of science of food, they know this stuff, don't they?
They do. I just finished reading a book called The Dorito Effect, and one of the stories in there is that they came up with a new corn chip, and if people thought it was okay, but then they came up with that sort of taco spice, which is in the Doritos chips, and it it signals that there are qualities in the food that make you want to keep eating it, but then it doesn't actually deliver those nutrients. And so you never get the signal that you've had enough of them because you keep getting the signal that there's going to be nutrition here without actually ever getting the nutrition. And
Yeah.
so then, that's part of the problem with some ultra processed foods is that they have an on signal, but they don't have any off switch.
Yes. So what do you think the solution to this is then? I mean, do you in your book, do you discuss what the solutions are?
Well, I do talk about, how we need to reshape our food environment. We need to think about how to engage with restaurants, how to engage with industry and others in order to change those values and the analysis that we're doing. I'm not trying to ban any particular type of food. There's no such thing as a bad food. They're just bad diets. So you can eat Doritos as long as they're part of a healthy diet. The problem is that many of us are eating 75% of our food that's ultra processed, and that tends not to be very healthy. And so it's not going to be an easy problem to solve because a lot of this has to do with income inequality and people not having the resources, either the money or the time to prepare healthy food. People are struggling. People are doing the best they can with what they have. And so there's not going to just be one solution. Um, I do think, part of it is awareness that these our current approach is not doing us any good. In the United States and some other places, they're looking at things like food prescriptions and sort of a food as medicine approach. And, that might be that, a doctor can actually prescribe fruits and vegetables for you. And, part of having a healthier diet would be, well, for many people, there's a cost associated with buying fruits and vegetables if you're on a sort of a fixed income. And I don't just mean the economic cost of buying those fruits and vegetables, but if your kids don't eat them and they go bad, that's an even bigger cost. And so you're not so willing to take a chance on introducing new foods to your family. And we know that when you introduce a new food, it often takes a lot of introductions in order for people to sort of come to like it, or
Yeah.
first to come to try it and then come to like it. And so for many families, it's not worth the risk.
Mm.
And so a food as medicine can help us to overcome that. The more fruits and vegetables you have on your plate, the more you crowd out unhealthy stuff. And
Yeah.
so, so you just end up eating healthier anyway. And
That's
so I
right.
think, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say something, but please carry on. Sorry.
No, I think that, we need to recognize that it's not just about the food, it's not just about the environment, it's our lifestyles. Some people don't have refrigeration or they don't have a freezer, so we need to, it's not just people making bad choices, it's people making the best choices within the context of their lives. And, we some people want to blame individuals for it, but if 75% of people are overweight or obese, it's the system. It's
Yeah.
not the individuals.
Yeah. But it doesn't look like the system is going to change anytime soon, really, does it? That's the problem.
Well, I mean, I think that, we may be reaching a bit of tipping point. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization came out with a report late last year that identified sort of the cost to our food, our economic system of unhealthy food, and globally it's something like 10 to 12 trillion dollars, and in the United States it's about $1 trillion a year from diet-related illnesses, and that's a huge economic burden, and that's every year. And so you have to wonder, if we're spending $1 trillion to make unhealthy people a little less unhealthy,
Mm.
how much should we be willing to spend to keep people healthy
Yes.
or to actually make them healthy? And, right now we don't really see them as the same budgets, but, I think we could spend a heck of a lot more money making great food affordable, and, that would be a really nice way of spending that money instead of on, diabetes medication and other things. I mean, we have to do that, but it'd be better if we didn't have to do that.
Yes. I know at the COP28, the roadmap, the UN roadmap, they advised certain measures, didn't they? Including, that's kind of advertising should be kind of focused on especially when it comes to children, that they should stop advertising food which is unhealthy for the planet, particularly, but also unhealthy for their health. So, I mean, I wonder how that will actually manifest.
Yeah, there was the Emirates Declaration that came out of COP28 as well. And yeah, I mean, people's habits are set early. And so if we can uh, find ways of introducing healthier food choices and food education in elementary schools or early schools, then I think people can take those habits with them. We saw this with a lot of sort of environmental beliefs and things like that. Kids said turn out the lights. Kids, sort of bring home these ideas, and then it can actually influence what the rest of the family does. And if the kids are more open to healthy eating, then I think that could absolutely influence the rest of the families.
Yes, in my family, it was always a case of you could help yourself to fruits, but if you wanted a biscuit or sweets, you had to ask for permission, which kind of set us a kind of um, uh, a standard, maybe, that's kind of fruit was free, but the rest you had to pay for, so in some way.
Yeah, and sometimes things like that can backfire. Also though, it's like, if somebody's telling you you have to eat it, it makes it seem like, well, it probably isn't the best thing. We need the kids to be seeing us eating healthy food as well. Our kids, imitate what we do, and we want the fruits and or the vegetables in our meals to be amazing. We too often, they're steamed or boiled or something, and they're not the most appetizing thing on the dish.
Yes.
And and again, I know people are time starved, and so it's hard, but if you can make your vegetables amazing, then the kids will enjoy eating them. And that's part of what I did with my family during COVID. I cooked a lot of meals with the kids, and we did our best to make the vegetables as amazing as possible and a variety. And I was over the Christmas, my son and we were visiting family, and my son said, "Oh, I'm craving vegetables. They don't serve enough here at my parents' house."
Oh,
So
wow. That's
I
good.
was like, "Ah, that's
Yes.
great to hear."
Yeah. So I saw you first, Jack, at the Food Hack meeting in Nottingham last December. And I was taken by some of the things you were saying around cultivated meat, because as you're probably aware, this podcast kind of looks at alternative proteins and has an interest in cultivated meat and precision fermentation and other kind of novel foods in that space. So how do you think cultivated meat is going to sort of take off, and what do you think are going to be some of the challenges there?
And just as background, I've engaged with the cultivated meat space for quite some time. We call it cultivated meat today, but 5 years ago we were referring to it as clean meat. And sort of to the extent I have a claim to fame, one of the things that I did was help to kill the term clean meat. And I worked with all of the companies in the United States really over the course of 10 months and was able to convince them all to stop using the term clean meat, and they chose to go with cultivated. And part of that was to de-escalate that tension between livestock producers and these companies, because when you call it clean meat, you're sort of implying that the other meat is both dirty and unethical. And that makes people angry. And when people are angry, they retaliate, and that creates conflict. Um, and so I think the less conflict you have with the traditional livestock industry, the better for everyone.
Mm.
Um, but to your question, about, I whether or not people, will be interested in this, I think so much depends on how products are introduced to the market. And, are they introduced as, um, premium, terrific products, or are they introduced as something that's sort of a byproduct or a low quality product or a product for the masses? So
Mm.
that product positioning has a lot to do with, what people think about it and whether or not it's something that's being sort of foisted upon them or something that they should aspire to.
Yeah, I suppose there are different ways, aren't there? Because they can kind of replace natural meat by stealth in your chicken nuggets, and perhaps you would never notice. Or they could sell the premium products like they are cultivating caviar and um, certain premium beef products, kind of what's it called,
Wagyu. Yeah,
wagyu,
Wagyu.
wagyu, and also in England now they're looking. I think one of the first products in the UK to go to the regulator, or at least they're hoping to sell, is a Scotch egg made from made from cultivated meat. So I suppose it's going to be a bit of a novelty at first, or it's going to be en masse. So it's hard to know which way it's going to go, really, isn't it?
Okay. I suspect that, at least early on, it's going to be more of an ultra premium product, because it's going to take a while for the value to come down. And that means that, it's probably going to be sold as, sort of a mixed product that's sort of plant-based plus cultivated, not because they're trying to create filler, but because, they're trying to make it go as far as possible.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to, taste some of these products in the UK last month, or I guess in January, and it was a cultivated meatball. And the company had three different products. They had a plant-based meatball, they had their cultivated, and then they had just a regular meatball. And I was there with four of us coming from the University of Nottingham, and two of us were right, and we identified the cultivated meat, and two people selected the traditional meatball as the cultivated meat. And so, that it's reaching a point where, you know, people aren't sure, which is which. And
Was
but I
this
think the main
Remeat? Was the company Remeat in Sweden?
no, no,
Oh,
this was one of the US or one of
oh,
the UK
okay,
companies.
okay.
And so I think that, it needs to be introduced as a ultra premium product, because there's not going to be that much of it. People need to sort of be fighting to get a chance to sample it. And, then it becomes more available. This is kind of the model that Impossible Foods did in the United States and for those who don't know, Impossible Foods is the one that has sort of the heme that makes it sort of bloody, and that comes from precision fermentation, where they took the heme from the rootstock of soy. And because it was more expensive, it took them a while in order to bring costs down. But in the meantime, they were selling it in high-end restaurants for $20-$25 a burger.
Hmm.
And that created buzz, that created interest and excitement. And so by the time it came to market, people were sort of, wanted to take a selfie with the burger because nobody else could get it. And I think that's the kind of excitement that you want as you're introducing something, especially while production is low.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're allowed to say what the name of the company in the UK was, or is. Was it Aleph Farms by any chance?
It was not, no.
Um,
Um,
or
yeah,
or Ivy? No,
it was Ivy Farms. Yeah,
was Ivy Farms, right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. And
Yep.
and you couldn't tell the difference between the two, or you?
I did. So I got it right, but
Yeah.
two of my colleagues were mistaken as to which one it was. Yeah.
Is that because there was a difference in taste, or
There was a difference in texture,
right?
and so I think some people were like, well, this one tastes meatier, but so for me, the cultivated meat one was a little bit drier in its consistency, and that's just how the cells are. Whereas the other one, because a regular meatball has probably 40% plant material too. It's not 100% meat in a meatball. I think the texture of that, they thought that was less meat like, and so sort of mistaken as to what was not what they expected.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. So I just wanted to go back also to something you were saying earlier about upsetting the meat industry or upsetting farmers. I know there's been some evidence recently that the level of negative misinformation around plant-based food and alternative proteins sort of outweighs quite significantly the positive news. Do you think this is going to be a problem in the
Well,
future?
yeah, I mean, I certainly think it can be. We've seen efforts to ban these products in, Italy, France, Austria already. So I think there's a real threat that these products are not even allowed to go onto the market.
Mm.
I've been trying to address that in some of my recent speeches, and so I do a lot of public speaking. Last week I was in Canada speaking to the Alberta Beef Conference, and that's the largest beef sector in Canada. The week before that, I was at the National Farmers Union. The week before that, I was at a crop conference in Canada. Earlier today, I was doing the uh, one of the low carbon conferences here in the UK. And one of the things that I've been doing is that, and I'm speaking to a lot of these beef and dairy industry people, is I'm sort of asking them, what's the protein future that they think is best for them? Because you really need to understand what people want. And I would give them the option. It's like, well, option one is the one where what I call livestock wins. We need 25% more protein by 2050. And let's say livestock expands to meet that demand. So that's the livestock win scenario. And then in the second scenario, alternative proteins expand to meet that 25% demand. And then in the third scenario, it's sort of the livestock goes bust. We actually produce 25% less livestock in 2050. And so I asked the audience, which of those futures do you want? And of course, they mostly say, well, we want the one where livestock wins, where we have a thriving, expanding livestock sector.
Mm.
But then I point out, well, if demand increases and supply increases, your income is flat. But we cut down 10 or 20% of our forest and people hate you. So in scenario one, they're not any better off than they are today.
Mm.
In scenario two, demand increases, but supply of real meat is actually flat. We don't have to have any deforestation. They're almost certainly making more money. And then in scenario three, if we decreased livestock production by 25%, but we decreased it in the least productive countries in the world. Well, that's not the UK, that's not Europe, it's not North America. Well, they're probably making 4 or 5 times more money. And we take huge amount of pasture land out of production, and we can rewild it or do whatever we want with it. And so the world that is like wildly best for livestock producers here in the UK and in most of the high income countries is the one where livestock, is actually reduced or is about the same. And for me, that's really important because right now there's this competition and they're sort of attacking each other. And yet livestock does best when alternative protein succeeds, not
Mm.
when, we cut down forest and expand livestock production in Brazil. That's a terrible future for them.
Yes.
But that's the only way we actually increase production because you're not going to dramatically increase production here in the UK.
Mm. Yes. I mean, do you discuss the kind of benefits and the scourge of industrial farming, the sort of problems with industrial farming at all in your speeches?
Don't engage with it that often, but when I do, it's really to sort of highlight the trade-offs. I know that there's a lot of interest in regenerative agriculture, regenerative livestock production, and there are absolutely benefits in terms of animal welfare. There could be, uses of marginal lands that couldn't otherwise be used for crops. You might have, more local access to production. So there are a lot of things that can be good about regenerative agriculture, but one area where it will never be as good is it just emits a lot more carbon or methane. And so from a sustainability standpoint, those regenerative agriculture systems tend to be much worse than the intensive systems that nobody likes. And for me, I don't think that's a problem. I think that there's value in both of those systems, that we need some agriculture to have a light footprint and have more biodiversity because perhaps the land is more sensitive or it's next to a waterway or something else. Um, but it won't produce as much. And so somebody else will have to make up the difference. But most of the land needs to be in more intensive farming systems so that we don't need as much land somewhere else. And it's really about trade-offs. It's not about good or bad or right or wrong. It's just about choices and consequences. And we see some of this playing out, in Europe with the farm to fork strategy. That Europe wants to reduce fertilizer use, reduce pesticide use, and move to 25% organic. Well, if successful, they would then produce 15% less food.
Mm.
So the rest of the world has to increase the food that it produces for Europe. Well, the country that sends the most food to Europe is Brazil. And so if Europe export its environmental footprint to the most biodiverse country on the planet, that might not be a good idea.
Yeah.
But, that's a choice and that's a consequence, uh, that countries will have to make, based on their own situations.
I suppose this also depends on the development and uptake of precision fermentation and cultivated meat as well, doesn't it? How quickly that can be funded and brought to market.
Yeah, because I mean, the rest of the world will need more protein. And, it's not really fair for us to say, you know, we don't want more livestock, but we also don't want to, use these alternative proteins. People have a right to better health and nutrition. And
Mm.
as people's incomes increase, generally the first thing they want is more animal protein in their diet. And there are all sorts of health benefits. It reduces stunting, it improves cognitive development. And so there's a real need for that. It's very nutrient dense.
Mm.
But, what that might mean is that maybe in Western economies, we eat a little less meat. I mean, most of us eat more meat than we actually need in our diet in order to have a healthy diet. And most of us just eat more food than we need in order to have a
Yeah.
healthy diet. And so there's actually a lot to go around,
Yeah.
just by spreading that wealth a little bit.
Lots of countries are encouraging um, less meat to be eaten. And also part of the kind of the COP28 roadmap, they were trying to get people to encourage to eat less meat. But I mean, that was pretty sort of quietly announced because it's not going to be popular at all, is it?
Yeah, and it's interesting because they say they want people to eat less meat, but most of the policy is focused on reducing supply. And it's much easier to change supply than it is to shift diets.
Yeah.
The problem with that approach is, if one, the countries that are most likely to respond to that kind of pressure are Western economies that are super efficient. So, like the places that are most likely to reduce livestock production are the last places you should be reducing livestock production.
Mm.
Um, but the other danger is if you reduce production in those economies and demand remains flat, you're actually increasing global emissions and driving further deforestation. And
Yes.
so, one has to be very careful. Um, it's always going to be better for shifts in behavior to drive reductions in production than reductions in production with the hope of shifting
Mm.
diets.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a change of attitude, isn't it? I mean, we know that people can be persuaded to change their behaviors. I suppose we saw that with Brexit recently. But so I mean, really, perhaps the government should be doing more to promote um, eating less meat and to promote alternatives and things like that. Do you think the government are doing enough in that area?
Well, I am not a huge believer in uh, trying to convince people to change their minds because when you do that, people resist, and most of the ways we try to get people to eat less meat is, we talk about the health impacts or the morality or other things. And that creates dissonance. It's like, why do you, eat a pig, but you take home a puppy? The problem with that is that when you create dissonance, some people will say, okay, I'm going to go vegan or vegetarian, but the vast majority will actually create reactance. In other words, they don't like for you to try to change their minds and they'll go eat a double quarter pounder just to prove you wrong. And
Yeah,
so it's very hard to attack people's values and to try to change their minds.
but
It's
my
actually much
but
easier to change their behavior than it is to change their minds. And if you
yeah,
change the behavior, their minds will change. And
but
yet,
minds can be changed kind of subtly, I suppose. It hasn't got to be somebody sort of saying you have to stop doing this, you have to stop doing this. Yeah, I guess if they are geniuses at marketing and communication out there that really all they need to do is try and make the alternative more favorable, make
Mhm.
it cooler, have the celebrities coming out eating plant-based this and vegan that, because that's what catches on, isn't it?
I think that's part of it. I speak to a lot of alternative protein companies, and what I always tell the CEOs is most people will not buy your product because they believe what you believe. They will buy it in spite of it. You
Right.
actually need to get your own moral views out of the way. They are your biggest obstacle to success. If you have an amazing product, you have a great chance of success. If you have a mediocre product and you lead with morality, you are doomed to failure.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I have one more question for you. It's been lovely talking to you. I was just wanting to know whether you think in the future, people will start eating better. Do you think the future is sort of positive, or are you kind of worried about it?
I am cautiously optimistic. I think that, there's a lot of reason for hope. I mean, one is just thinking about the future of population. We all think about 2050 and the need to, or the fact that we'll have another 1.5 billion people on the planet going from 8 to 9.5 billion. But we seldom sort of stop to think what happens next. And what happens next is really quite amazing because we have already reached peak child. The number of children born this year is more than the number that will be born next year and the year after that, the year after that, the year after that. And so after 2050, population growth slows dramatically. And the only reason it's increasing right now is because of people living longer. It's not because we're having more kids. But sadly, we will not live forever. And so, things slow down dramatically after 2050. And so, we often sort of fear that we have to produce more and more food forever, and it's just this never-ending challenge, and things are going to be a disaster. But the reality is that it gets harder every day. It gets harder to feed the world between now and 2050. But every day after 2050, it will get easier to feed the world.
Right.
That's a huge opportunity. And so the challenge that we have is not to produce more food forever, it's to get to 2050 without screwing up the planet. Because if we do, we are good forever. And so one of the things I always try to leave my audience with is this idea that the next 25 years, they're not just the most important 25 years there have ever been in the 10,000 year history of agriculture, and they're the most important 25 years there will ever be in the
Mm,
history of agriculture. And that's why we need to get it right. And that's why we need to ensure that that next 25% of food production doesn't happen by adding 2 billion animals to the planet. It's done in a way that actually preserves our forest and preserves our rivers, our lakes, and our aquifers. Because what we win is a world in which everything gets easier.
mm.
And so, that's why these conversations are really important because we need to be able to bring these new innovations to market. Because science tells us what we can do, but ultimately it's the consumer who will tell us what we should do, and they
Right.
have to trust us to do it.
Well, that's very interesting, Jack. I mean, I wasn't aware of what you were saying in about 2050. I wonder whether you would be able to share a link with me that explains what is important about sort of 2050, and I can kind of, I can add it to the the blurb on the podcast so people can have a look at that once they've listened, because that sounds fascinating.
We'll see what I can track down.
Okay. Well, it's been great talking to you, Jack, and we are certainly living in interesting times, or perhaps the most interesting times. So, yes, thank you for coming on the Future of Food podcast.
For having me.